About a child that do love Jesus, here's one. Talk about a child that do love Jesus, here's one. Ever since I heard the gospel story, I've been walking down God's path to glory. Talk about a child that do love Jesus. Here's one. Talk about a child that's been converted. Here's one. Talk about a child that's been converted. Here's one. Once in Satan's snare, my soul had fallen, till the day I heard my Jesus calling. Talk about a child that do love Jesus. Here's one.
Thank you, Leah. I was blessed. I was worshipped. There were two kings, and they faced off. It was the clash of the titans. King Croesus, and I forgot my remote here, so I'm going to grab that real fast. King Croesus of Lydia is coming up against Cyrus of Persia. Now, King Croesus is considered the richest man in the world, and he is armed with an oracle from Delphi. And the oracle says this: if you cross the Halys River, you will destroy an empire. Croesus figuring that the empire, that the oracle is somewhat nebulous, but he figures that the empire is talking about is the Persian Empire. He doesn't think it's him. Now, if only he had consulted the oracle of Daniel, like we talked about this morning in our Sabbath school class, he might have been in a somewhat different position. Because remember Cyrus, the same Cyrus that Daniel deals with? Well, if you recall from our Sabbath school lesson that we just talked about, the bear, which represents Persia, Medo-Persia, has 3 ribs in its mouth, representing Babylon, Egypt, and Lydia. The same Lydia that Croesus is king of. Well, they meet. The battle is somewhat indecisive, and winter is coming on. And in that part of the world, you often did not fight during the winter. You know, even David talks about a fighting season, King David. Well, so Croesus goes back to his capital, Sardis. And if you look here at the mountain, that mountain right there, you can see a little bit of the top there. That is his mountaintop fortress. And he retires up there. But Cyrus hasn't had enough. Cyrus shows up. Now, Croesus is probably feeling that this is a breach of battlefield etiquette. What are you doing showing up in the winter to fight? We don't do that. But on the other hand, Croesus is going, whatever. I've got my mountaintop fortress, which is impregnable. And so a bit of music history that you will not hear anywhere else, that it was King Croesus and his band, Asleep at the Switch, that first sang the song Can't Touch This. All right? Cyrus, for the longest time, couldn't touch this. Cyrus has to camp down there until they see a Lydian soldier. One of Cyrus's guys happens to spot a Lydian soldier drop his bronze helmet over the wall. He watches. The Lydian soldier comes around on a path they had not noticed before, gets his helmet. Now keep in mind, a bronze helmet, they were not mass-produced in China. They were very expensive. He would have been in major, major trouble if he'd shown up at roll call without his helmet. So rather than he thought he's probably being careful, goes down, grabs helmet, goes back up. Persian soldier sees this, goes and tells the commander, Cyrus, guess what I saw? A new way in. Croesus and army are defeated when they attack at night in this new way in. What's even more astounding is that 300 years later, the same thing will happen again. An army will come up against Sardis, seemingly impregnable walls. They will then spot the place in the wall that is not being guarded because they think that nobody can get there. And sure enough, twice Sardis will fall. If you have your Bibles, open them with me to our passage of study. Revelation chapter 3, verses 1 through 6 is our passage of study this morning. Revelation chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. John, through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is referencing this lapse. And he says, wake up, strengthen what remains and is about to die, for I have not found your deeds complete in the sight of God. Mike, should I just use the pulpit mic because I'm getting a lot of feedback here? Let's just do that. He is clearly referencing this attack where he says, wake up. Because they thought they were invulnerable, that nobody was going to do anything to them. Some of you have no doubt seen the classic film Napoleon Dynamite. And if you've ever seen Napoleon Dynamite, there is a character in there that all of you, even if you have not seen the film, can identify with, called Uncle Rico. Uncle Rico cannot get past high school. He can't get past 1982. There was a game where football scouts had come and the coach had taken him out of the ball game and let another guy play quarterback, and Uncle Rico believes if only he had been in that game, the scouts would have seen him, he would have gotten a football scholarship, and his life would have been totally different. Rico cannot get past 1982. He is locked in 1982. And even if you've not seen the film, some of you know people like that who are stuck years ago in an event or whatever it was. Sometimes it's just hairstyle. You know, they got a hairstyle they loved way back when. I had a grandmother like that. It was very fashionable back in the day. Not so fashionable towards the end of her life. No, we didn't tell her that. Revelation 3:1 says this, I know your deeds. You have a reputation of being alive, but you're dead. Sardis is the Uncle Rico of the churches. It's stuck in the past. It's living on their old reputation. Sardis actually did have an amazing reputation. This reputation, first of all, as I alluded to, it had been the kingdom of Lydia. And in Greek mythology, that mountaintop that I showed where they had the fortress, that is supposedly the birthplace of both Zeus and Dionysus, some of the greatest gods in Greek mythology. In fact, the legend of King Midas, you know the guy who had the golden touch? Sometimes you see the car commercials, Midas car commercials, where the guy's touching everything, turning things to gold. Well, that takes place in Sardis, in the river there. Well, after, as the legend goes, Midas discovers that touching everything and turning everything to gold is not such a great idea. He is told he has to go wash himself in the Pateaued River, and that's where the legend comes from, that the Pateaued River had all this gold and silver in it, which led to Sardis being the first place in the world to mint coins. So if you think about, the coins that you have now in your pocket, before Sardis, they were not minting coins. So Sardis has an interesting reputation. It's actually a fairly amazing reputation. Sardis is renowned for being the first place to invent dice. For your board games, think about all your different board games if you didn't have dice. In fact, Sardis is also supposedly the first place that invented the ability to dye wool. They have an amazing reputation. And it goes on. Aesop's fables, the tortoise and the hare, and other fables. Aesop came through Sardis. And beyond that, Sardis is at the end of the royal road that goes between what is now Turkey, or at that time was Lydia or Asia Minor, and Persia. That might have also helped explain why the Persian army came down that road. But it meant that a lot of wealth was going through Sardis. Because if you're on the main highway, or if you're at the end of that main highway, guess what's coming through your town that you can tax? And so there's a lot of wealth going through them. Unfortunately, by John's time for Sardis, Sardis was kind of a backwater city. It was a has-been city. Yeah, you might have a great reputation, but what are you now? You're not Smyrna. You're not Ephesus. You're not Pergamum. Those were the major cities during John's time in that neck of the woods, not Sardis. And you wonder if possibly the Christians in that church were still kind of living off that old reputation. We used to live this city was a great city. And you wonder if maybe they also would talk about how great the church used to be as well. John continues, I know your deeds. You have a reputation of being alive, but you are dead. How many churches have you seen that have a reputation from the past? They were once thriving, powerful churches, and now are struggling. Maybe even we say, kind of almost a zombie, a walking dead church. A small group of people in a big sanctuary. Maybe that doesn't tell the whole story. If you listen to the people in the congregation, they will often say, remember when Pastor so-and-so was here and we used to do all these different things? If you hear conversations like that, your church may have more in common with Sardis. It may be the Uncle Rico version of churches. The problem is, and let's be honest, as I go around the conference and I get to be in a bunch of different churches, I get to see a lot of Sardisian churches. Churches that believe it's 1959 when Leave It to Beaver was the hit TV show and not 2020. You look at the different TV shows that I have up on the screen, they're nothing like Leave It to Beaver. And that list is even probably a little bit old. I'm not sure how many of those shows are actually still running in production. I think several of them have already stopped. But a lot of our church is kind of like this utopian view of Leave It to Beaver. It's kind of this pure, fun version. And we think, wasn't life so much simpler in 1959? When you want to do evangelism, you knew how to do evangelism. You just call in the conference evangelist. The conference evangelist would come to, not for a month. They didn't do 1 month seminars back then. It was 3 to 6 months. Now, how many church members can we even get out for a week? Life has changed. But for a lot of our Sardisian churches, it has not. They're still stuck in 1959, believing, wishing, like Uncle Rico, that if only we keep doing the same thing, that maybe things are going to change. And you and I both know that's the definition of insanity, to keep doing the same thing and think you're going to get a different result. And yet, like Sardis, we have a lot of churches that have a great reputation from the past, but nothing's happening. Russell Burrell, in his book, Waking the Dead, which he could have been writing about Sardis as well, but he's writing it to this day, says this. He says, a church has to be willing to continue to adapt to its surroundings by relating to the culture that surrounds the church. If a church doesn't adapt, it ultimately becomes like the Amish, who have done well to preserve the heritage of the past, but no longer relate to the contemporary world. I've shared with you before that in my regular job as ministerial director for the conference, I get to go around to a number of different churches. And one of them that I've had some dealings with is a church in Fortuna. Now, maybe most of you have not been to Fortuna, maybe one or two of you have. It's a large church, sanctuary, I should say. It used to have a booming congregation. The picture on the right is the picture of their school. Their school, at one time, believe it or not, had 165 students in its heyday. That's a good-sized school. 165 students. Now, the school is a one-room classroom. They rent out the rest to a charter school. And they're struggling to just keep the one-room school open. The fishing industry changed. The logging industry changed. The jobs up there are not the same. And if you know anything about that region of California, it's called the Emerald Triangle because of the marijuana growing. And a lot of Christian churches, including the Amish church, have struggled to reach that crowd because that crowd has not always been the most open to church. And so churches up there, including the Adventist church, have shrunk. The world has changed. And yet the church has struggled to adapt to change. And now the big debate at the Fortuna church is, do you sell this now oversized church that they have, and do you rebuild a smaller one? But I hate to say this, the obvious is, well, if you sell it, who's going to buy it? Because it's not like there are a lot of churches up there that are booming either. But I've also seen a number of churches. Right now, we have a change in the Napa Valley. Housing changed it. That used to be, when I was a student at Pacific Union College, there in Angwin, in Napa Valley, we used to joke that it was an Adventist ghetto. No longer. People can't afford to live there. It's gotten very, very expensive. Now we have too many churches, and I predict in 10 years, we're probably closing at least 1 or 2 churches in that area. I know another church in a city that is booming, and you have a dinky little congregation because they have decided they want to keep things, leave it the Beaver way, the way they used to do it. In fact, they have church members who live in that same town who go to other churches because they don't want to go to that church because of the leave it to beaver mentality. Let's lock it down in 1959 and just ignore the world around us. They pride themselves on being faithful. They're faithful to what they knew of 1959, and they think anything else is compromise. But what they forget is that they are failing to fulfill the gospel commission. They are no more relevant. They are not relevant at all to the society, to the area, culture, town around them. Sardis offers us a couple of different cautions. The first one, a church that is lost in its past, that's no longer relevant to its current community. But Sardis also offers us another caution. And its other caution is it is possible to become so spiritually, so culturally relevant that we become spiritually irrelevant. Look at this text one more time. I know your deeds. You have a reputation of being alive. We could say culturally relevant. But you are spiritually dead. That could be another interpretation of this. Let's go back and see if we can see this in our passage of study. What you need to know about Sardis was the major deity of Sardis was Cybele. Cybele has some interesting things. She was the one who promised life after death. She promised fertility. And you got to remember, this is a huge grape-growing agricultural area. And all the grapes and everything else, fertility is very big to farmers. In fact, you would often see her with a goblet or a dish in her hand, as you can see in the pictures behind me. Cybele cult was a strong rival to Christianity. In fact, Augustine, who would write a couple of hundred years later, is strongly cautioning, even a couple of hundred years later, about the dangers of Cybele, the cult of Cybele. She's worshipped as the great mother power. And she is the mother of all, including the mother of earth. But that's not all. Her priestesses, because it's a fertility cult, would be encouraged to do, I don't want to keep this as G-rated as possible, but let's just say they exercised fertility cult practices in the temple. In fact, that temple there in Sardis got such a reputation that young girls would come to earn their dowries in prostitution at the Sardisian Cybele temple. And I won't even go into, I mentioned the priestesses. The priestesses were male. That may tell you something else about the Cybele cult. Cybele is most commonly pictured on a lion, seated on a lion or next to it with a cup in her hand. Does that symbol sound familiar? I think under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, I think John is borrowing. He talks about Jezebel, but John is taking different symbols that they are going to be familiar with and reinterpreting them. And I think he's helping them understand, you know who Cybele is? Well, she's really the harlot of Revelation that causes churches to be unfaithful. And that probably was a very serious issue there in Sardis. Today, if you visit Sardis, you're going to come across the very, very impressive gymnasium. They had baths in there. The Greek culture was kind of centered around the body. But you also need to remember, in English, we don't use it so much, but high school in German is gymnasium. It's also an education center. And you got to be aware, too, of all the different things that they would be educating the young people about in this center. And it's going to involve a number of different Hellenistic thought, including the vices that go with the Hellenistic world, with the baths and everything else, the Roman baths. Well, because these things are so notorious, these Roman baths could be so notorious, the Jews would warn their people to stay away from the gymnasiums. In fact, they would forbid their people to be a part of the gymnasiums. In fact, if you look up in Maccabees, it's very interesting to read what they're saying in Maccabees about how the Greeks, this is about 160 years before Christ, how the Greeks and the Greek-thinking Jews, how they had the Jews in Jerusalem compromise. Look at this. In those days, lawless men came forth from Israel, so Jews, misled many, saying, "Let's go and make a covenant with the Gentiles round about us, for since we separated from them, many evils have come upon us." This proposal pleased them, and some of the people eagerly went to the king. Let's see, come on, next slide. Let's go back. He authorized them to observe the ordinances of the Gentiles, so they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to the Gentile custom, and removed the marks of circumcision and abandoned the Holy Covenant. They joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil. What's really, really interesting is the Jews see the gymnasium as being one of the major compromise points of their faith because of what all was going on with the gymnasium. We'll come back to that. Hold that thought for a second. What's also interesting about Sardis is it had the largest Jewish synagogue outside of Israel. This synagogue could seat 1,000 people. Now, there are several different differences with this synagogue. First of all, unlike regular synagogues, it did not have a male and female section. So you're going, okay, it's a little bit different synagogue, fairly progressive for that time. Here you have the chief seats. And you remember when Jesus talked about the chief seats? You know, when he said this about them, that's what it would have looked like. Come on, next slide. There we go. Beware of scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love respectful greetings in the marketplaces and the chief seats in the synagogues. That's what the chief seats would have looked like. Those were the special places. Sardis also had some other unique features. It had the public water fountain there in their synagogue. Now, given how Jews often like to kind of keep themselves at a distance from everybody, it's very unusual that they would be inviting Gentiles to come to get water in their synagogue or in the courtyard of their synagogue. That might be telling you something about the Jewish outlook there, how it might have looked. The other thing, too, that they have in their synagogue are Sibylle lions. And you're going, what are Sibylle lions? The same character that I was talking about, who has a major temple there. What are Sibylle lions doing in the synagogue? And if we keep in mind something else, you need to ask yourself, where is this synagogue in relation to everything else in Sardis? The synagogue is actually in the gymnasium complex. Now, on one hand, you might say, well, they're trying to establish a place, an outpost in this very pagan area where they're trying to say, you know, we're trying to evangelize the people around us. My only problem with that thought, it's a good thought if that's really what was happening. But unfortunately, if they were really doing their job, they would have been kicked out of there. Because they would have gotten tired of them always challenging what they were doing, challenging the vice, challenging all the different things. And their synagogue could not have stayed there if that's really what they were doing. Now, at the time of John, unlike in Smyrna and Ephesus, some of these other places, the Christians in Sardis are still likely meeting with the Jews in the synagogue. So what's happening there is the Christians are in what appears to be somewhat of a compromised setting. I mean, why in the world would you have Sibley lions in your synagogue? It seems to be a rather strange thing to have, and if that's what the Christians are doing. And maybe they started off going great faith, and now they've kind of living off the past reputation, and maybe they're trying to be so culturally relevant to the community around them that they're no longer spiritually relevant. Verse 4, or before that, you have a reputation of being alive, but you are dead. Yet you have a few people in Sardis who have not soiled their clothes, verse 4, and they will walk with me dressed in white, for they are worthy. On the bulletin that Celia prepared, you see a picture of the Temple of Artemis. You got to understand how big this temple is. This is a huge temple. In fact, it was the 7th biggest Greek temple in the world at its time. Artemis, remember in Ephesus when they were so upset with Paul and they come and they're shouting, great is Artemis of the Ephesians? That same Artemis. This is a huge, huge temple. Okay, that's a bus back there. Now, the bus is a little ways away. But that bus size gives you, here's people standing here. Look how big these columns are in comparison to these people. It's a huge temple. But there's something else that you need to understand that's going on here. There's another structure there that's not readily apparent. It's also in your bulletin. And that is about the 4th century, 300s. The Christians would build a church on the back end of the Artemis temple. Right in here, you can kind of see I've circled it. So that was a Christian church. Now, in fairness to the Christians, the Artemis temple by that time was probably not very active, but we do know that there were, because archaeologists have found Artemis artifacts around there. It'd be a little bit like today, like if a church was to build on a former Playboy mansion, and that you would have to go through the Playboy mansion to get into church with artifacts from the Playboy mansion still there. And you might be wondering, why would they build their church there? Are they saying, Artemis is nothing, and so the church is taking over? And yet they really hadn't cleared out all the stuff from Artemis. You wonder what was going on with that church there. Had these Christians in Sardis become so culturally relevant that they were spiritually irrelevant? Were they just simply living off the past? There was a son, a Jewish boy. His bar mitzvah was coming up. And as Jewish families often will do, they asked him, what kind of present would you like for your bar mitzvah? And this is a very conservative, a Hasidic Jewish family, the most conservative. And he says, I'd like a PS4. Now, his parents have no idea what a PS4 is. And so they go and ask the rabbi. They said, our son for his bar mitzvah would like a PS4. We have no idea what that is. Do you have any idea? And he goes, I can't help you. I don't know what a PS4 is. He says, why don't you go and ask the Orthodox rabbi? So they go and ask the Orthodox rabbi and say, we were sent to you by our rabbi. Our son wants a PS4 for his bar mitzvah. Do you know what a PS4 is? And he says, I'm sorry, I can't help you. I don't know what a PS4. Why don't you go ask the Reformed rabbi? So they go and ask the Reformed rabbi and tell him the story that he wants a PS4 for his bar mitzvah. And the rabbi goes, PlayStation 4, that's one of the greatest consoles out there. Your son is going to love it. But what's a bar mitzvah? We often, I believe, confuse the church of Sardis with Laodicea. When we get to Laodicea, we're going to clear up some stuff about Laodicea that I think most Christians don't understand. They confuse Sardis with Laodicea. When they talk about compromise and other things, that's Sardis. It's not Laodicea. Laodicea was actually a good church, but we'll talk about that later. We have the challenge. We can't live like Leave It to Beaver and pretend it's 1959. It is no longer 1959. It is February 2020. The world has changed. It has changed dramatically. We can't keep doing things the same as we used to. We have to change. And yet, Sardis offers us a cautionary note. It's asking a question, are we locked in the past, living off our reputation? And the other cautionary question it asks, have we become so culturally relevant, though, in our desire to remain relevant to the culture around us, which is not bad, but then have we compromised to where we are spiritually irrelevant? I see it in churches all the time. I see churches trying to do what we used to do, just do it harder. Or I see other churches that they have jettisoned everything and they're saying, we just need to be like everybody else around us. Fortunately, I do see other churches that are trying to say, how do we become culturally relevant and be spiritually relevant at the same time? Interesting example of this comes from the Hollywood church. The Hollywood church had a wall problem. And you can kind of see it in these pictures here. It's got this ugly old wall right here. And they had a very interesting architect who designed their church. It's a very distinctive church, some of you have ever seen it. Very distinctive. But their wall problem was really hurting their evangelism. In fact, no less than the LA Times took on the Adventist church in Hollywood. Here's what the LA Times had to say about them. It says, the worst part of the Seventh-day Adventist church is its attitude towards the city. From the street level, its great curving gesture remains hidden behind a deep and tall wall of textured concrete block. This keeps the street noise and violence out, but also manages to project a sense of animosity toward Hollywood. How are you going to minister to a community that you are projecting animosity towards? That you put up this great barrier and say, okay, we're like this enclave in hostile territory. Well, they decided to work on that. They started working with the community. In fact, LA Public Works Department even gave them a grant of $10,000. And in the end, they dramatically changed the outside of that wall. Because that wall was communicating, we're not with you. We don't want to be a part of you. And if you look at it, this is just paint. That's that same wall, but they painted it very creatively so it matched the architecture of the building behind it, and it doesn't have that look of animosity that the LA Times was complaining about. We have to figure out ways, and this church is working on it. This church, by saying we want to tackle homelessness, we want to figure out ways that we can minister to the community around us. And I got to say kudos to this church for working on it, but we can't stop. We've got to keep figuring out in this church how we avoid the Sardis trap of living off the past, and yet remaining spiritually relevant to our culture around us. Christ's message to the church of Sardis is this. I think my remote died. There we go. It says, do we still have our Christian fervor or flavor? Christ asks Sardis, and by extension, he's asking us. He who overcomes will be dressed in white. I will never blot out his name from the book of life, but will acknowledge his name before my Father and his angels. May we in the Concord Church never lose our fervor or our flavor for Christ.